In October 1942, the German command in Stalingrad received a strange report. A Wehrmacht assault group, confident in an easy breakthrough to the Volga, had hit an invisible wall. They reported a whole battery of anti-tank guns and camouflaged bunkers that had turned an elite tank company into a pile of burning metal in a single night. But when the smoke cleared, the truth shocked even the seasoned colonels. There was no battery. There were no bunkers. All this hell had been unleashed by a single Soviet tank with a half-dead crew that had violated all laws of physics and common sense. They used a tactic that would later be called suicidal and banned from textbooks. A tactic that turned 40 tons of steel into an elusive pendulum of death, while burning men alive right inside their combat vehicle. How did 4 men cheat death? And why was their unique experience deemed too dangerous for others? Find out the story of the crew that became a ghost. October 1942. Stalingrad. The Red October Factory District. The ground here didn't just tremble. It behaved like a liquid. Every 15 seconds, an artillery barrage reshaped the landscape, turning the solid walls of workshops into rubble, and rubble into gray, suffocating dust. The air in Battalion Commander Gromov's bunker was thick as molasses. It smelled of dampness, cheap tobacco, and that distinct, sharp stench that comes only from a mixture of hot machine oil and coagulated blood. A lamp made from a 45mm shell casing flickered in time with the explosions, snatching a map marked with blue and red pencils from the gloom. The map was lying. The streets drawn on it no longer existed. There were only lines of fire and piles of broken brick. Lieutenant Koval stood before the table, leaning his fists on the tabletop. His hands were black with soot, with ingrained grease under his nails that no soap could remove. He looked at the map, but saw not paper, but the dark void of Zavodskaya Street. It wasn't a street anymore. It was a bottleneck, a concrete sack. The only path by which a German assault group could break through to the Volga that night. Gromov didn't look the lieutenant in the eye. The battalion commander was wiping his glasses with a piece of rag, and that sound, the dry squeak of cloth on glass, cut the ears sharper than the distant howl of 6-barreled mortars. The radio in the corner was choking on static and fragments of panicked commands. Somewhere to the left, infantry was burning. Somewhere to the right, sappers were trying to mine passages, but were being pinned down by sniper fire. Here, in Koval's sector, it was still quiet. The silence before the hammer blow. Intelligence reports movement. Gromov's voice was hollow, devoid of intonation. Grid 1240. They hear tracks. A lot of them. Judging by the sound, heavy engines. Most likely a full company. 8, maybe 10 boxes, plus support infantry and assault guns. Koval remained silent. He shifted his gaze from the map to his hands. The arithmetic was simple and terrible. 10 guns against 1. 75mm of a German cannon against his 76. Their optics, allowing them to put a shell through a vent from a kilometer away, against his cloudy periscope. This wasn't a tactic. It was an execution. You have 1 tank, Lieutenant. Gromov finally put on his glasses and raised a heavy gaze to the officer. The verdict was readable in the commander's eyes. No reserves. Artillery is cut off. Infantry. 12 men, and they have 1 grenade per brother left. The Germans will come at night. They need a breakthrough to the river before dawn. If they get through along Zavodskaya, the factory will be cut in half. The battalion commander fell silent. In the bunker, one could hear earth trickling down from the log ceiling.
Orders.
Gromov exhaled the word along with cigarette smoke. Not one step back. Hold the bottleneck. At any cost. Even if you have to become part of the Foundation. Koval slowly straightened up. He was calm. It wasn't the heroic calm of a poster warrior, but the icy indifference of a mechanic assigned to repair a hopeless machine. Fear had vanished. Only the physics of the process remained. He knew his tank. He knew his crew. And he knew that the chances of surviving this math problem were 0.0. But the problem demanded a solution. "I need shells." The lieutenant's voice sounded unexpectedly loud and dry. "Armor-piercing. I have half a rack of high explosives, but against Panzer IVs they're as useful as peas. Give me a full load of solid shots. And fuel." "You'll get the shells," Gromov nodded. "Take everything from the disabled ones at the repair base. Siphon the diesel from the tractor." Koval adjusted his headset. The leather creaked. He checked the clasp, a habitual motion honed to automatism. An invisible calculator was already clicking in his head, figuring firing sectors, armor angles, and reload times. Emotions were switched off. Right now, they would only get in the way. Emotion is an extra second of delay, and a second is a slug in the side. "And one more thing, Comrade Battalion Commander." Koval already had his hand on the canvas flap of the exit. "Don't bother me on the comms. Don't demand reports every 5 minutes. I'll work according to the situation. If I'm silent, it means I'm busy. Or already burned." Gromov didn't answer, just waved his hand. A heavy gesture with which one sees someone off to the scaffold. The lieutenant walked out into the night. A cold October wind hit his face, carrying the smell of burning and wet iron. The darkness was dense, tangible. Only the flares over the front lines snatched the skeletons of the destroyed workshops of the Red October factory from the gloom. It was a city of dead giants. Protruding rebar resembled torn tendons. Concrete slabs hung by a thread, ready to collapse from the slightest vibration. The ideal place for an ambush. And the ideal grave. 100 meters away, hidden in a semi-destroyed hangar, stood his T-34. The machine was old, Sormovo built. The armor was scarred from ricochets. The turret bore the soot of previous battles. The engine was cooling, quietly crackling, like a beast catching its breath. This tank wasn't just a mechanism. It was their home, their armor, and their coffin. The crew was waiting. The driver, the loader, the radio man. They sat on the armor, smoking one rolled cigarette between them. In the darkness, the ember of the cigarette seemed like the only living point in the entire universe. They didn't ask questions. They saw the lieutenant's face and understood everything without words. Hard, dirty work lay ahead. Work of destruction and survival. Koval walked up to the machine and placed his palm on the cold metal of the front plate. The armor vibrated from distant explosions. Through the soles of his boots, he felt the trembling of the earth. A kilometer away, German drivers were already warming up the engines of their panzers and self-propelled guns. There, breeches clanged and optics were checked. The Wehrmacht's massive steel machine was preparing to grind down this single Russian tank. The lieutenant looked at his watch. The phosphorescent hands showed just past 2 in the morning. No time remained for reflection. No time for fear either. Ahead was only the night, ruins, and the necessity of turning 40 tons of iron into a deadly pendulum. "Mount up," he commanded quietly. The sound of hatches slamming shut sounded like a rifle bolt. One tank against an armada. An equation that was impossible to solve. But they were going to try. The crew didn't dig into the earth. A trench for a tank in urban combat is just a pre-dug grave. a static target for German aviation or artillery spotters sitting on the roofs of surviving high-rises. Instead of shovels, they used crowbars and pieces of chalk. Lieutenant Koval turned the ruins of the sorting workshop into a training ground. He knew every corner here, not from maps. Before the war, he had worked in this very shop as a shift foreman. He remembered where the utility lines ran, where the heavy presses stood, foundations that could now support the weight of a 30-ton machine, and where the floor was flimsy, with gaping basement voids underneath. This was the geometry of survival. Koval walked among the twisted concrete slabs and drew crosses on the soot-covered walls. Pop-up points. Places where the tank could appear for 3 seconds, spit death, and vanish before the enemy could react. The ruins of Red October were turning into a minotaur's labyrinth, where hunter and prey could switch places in an instant. "Here is point 1, the lieutenant's voice sounded muffled due to his headset. He slapped his palm against the brickwork, miraculously intact after the bombing. "Exit at a 45-degree angle. Sector of fire, the intersection. Range, 150 meters. Withdrawal, strictly backward, into the shadow of the crane." The driver, whom the whole crew simply called Uncle Vasya, nodded. A former tractor driver from near Saratov, he looked at the ruins not as a soldier, but as a plowman facing the task of cutting a furrow through a rocky field. His hands, broad, with grease ingrained into the skin, rested on the steering levers. The T-34 76 was a rough machine, demanding not just control, but physical violence. To shift gears on the old 4-speed transmission, one had to possess the strength of a blacksmith. There were no synchronizers. The gears engaged with a wild gnashing if you didn't guess the engine RPMs correctly. A mistake meant a stalled engine. In battle, a stalled engine meant death. The rehearsal began. Not fortification, but a rehearsal of a deadly dance. The V2 engine roared, belching a cloud of blue smoke that immediately filled the enclosed space of the workshop. It smelled of unburnt diesel, a heavy, oily smell that makes your head split within an hour. "First gear, go!" Koval shouted into the throat microphone. "Jerk it!" The tank lurched, clanking its tracks on the concrete. Uncle Vasya yanked the lever toward himself, disengaging the left steering clutch. The multi-ton behemoth obediently wagged its nose, skirting a pile of broken brick. Speed, minimal, but inertia, colossal. The T-34 rolled out into the wall breach just enough for the gun barrel to look onto the street. "Halt! Fire!" The lieutenant's command lashed their ears. The machine dipped its nose. The Christie suspension, soft and springy, bounced, absorbing the braking inertia. In real combat, at this moment, the gunner would have to acquire the target and stomp the firing pedal. 1 second. Another. "Back! Move it!" Koval screamed. Here began the hardest part. The mechanics of the pendulum. Uncle Vasya had to, without losing diesel RPMs, depress the main clutch, slam the heavy shift lever into reverse, and release the pedal. All this in split seconds, blindly, guided only by the engine's roar and the hull's vibration. If he held the clutch too long, the discs would burn. If he dropped it too sharply, the engine would choke. A jerk. The tank roared, tracks spinning in place, carving sparks from the concrete, and the machine leaped backward into the saving darkness of the workshop. "Too slow!" Koval was unhappy. He jumped down from the turret and ran to the driver's hatch. "Uncle Vasya, you're not plowing a field."
A German needs 6 seconds to traverse his turret. We have 3. You're taking 4. We're already burning, understand? We're already corpses. The driver wiped his face with the sleeve of his oily, padded jacket. Sweat left light trails on his dirty forehead. Inside the fighting compartment,
The temperature had already risen to 40 degrees Celsius, though the battle hadn't even started. Next to the running diesel, it was as hot as hell.
"The gearbox is stiff, Comrade Lieutenant,"
he wheezed, not looking at the commander.
"Second gear pops out. I have to hold it with my knee, and reverse. Reverse only goes in with a curse."
"Then curse," Koval cut him off. "Curse, but ram it in. Tighten the steering clutches, reduce the free play of the levers to a minimum. The tank must react to thought, not movement. Again. Back to start. Engine roar again. Jerk again. Forward, stop, back. Forward, stop, back." The tank thrashed in the stone sack like a trapped beast.
The grinding of metal on concrete was so loud it plugged their ears. The loader, Petter, a young guy with broad shoulders, practiced snatching shells from the rack. A 76mm fixed round weighed over 6 kilograms. In the cramped turret, packed with mechanisms, turning around with such a slug was an art. He had to ram the shell into the breech while the tank lunged forward, so that at the moment of the stop, the gun was already loaded.
"Armor piercing!" command. Clang of the wedge breech block. "High explosive!" command. Ring of a falling casing. They practiced this rhythm for an hour, then a second. The air in the shop turned blue with exhaust fumes. Their eyes watered. The driver's hands shook from overexertion. Driving a tank without hydraulic assist required monstrous effort. Every movement of the lever was 20 kilograms of load. In a single training session, a driver would lose a couple of kilograms of weight. But Uncle Vasya wasn't making mistakes anymore.
He began to feel the machine with his skin. He heard the gears begging to be shifted. He felt the moment the clutch discs grabbed with the sole of his boot. The tank ceased to be a collection of iron. It was becoming an exoskeleton, an extension of their nervous system. Koval checked the markings again. 3 main positions, 2 backups. Escape routes cleared of large debris. A track shouldn't slip on a brick at a critical moment. The sectors overlapped. It was a trap. And they were the bait. By 4 in the morning, silence fell over the workshop. The engine was killed to let it cool and save precious fuel. One could only hear the cooling metal clicking and the men breathing heavily. They sat on the floor, leaning their backs against the warm road wheels. Their arms buzzed, their heads rang. But the fear was gone. Muscle memory had pushed it out. The body knew what to do. The lieutenant looked at the breach in the wall. The darkness outside had grown thicker. Dawn was coming soon. But before dawn would be the most terrible time. The time when the panzers would attack. Koval knew the Germans were pedantic. They would come on schedule. And then the geometry he had drawn in this ruined workshop would collide with the brute force of Krupp's steel. An equation with one unknown had to be solved in the next half hour. "Check the periscopes," he said quietly. "Wipe them dry with a rag. Dust is our enemy. If I don't see the flash, you won't have time to pull the lever." No slogans. No words about the motherland. Only the cleanliness of optics and the tension of tracks. That was all that mattered 5 minutes before hell. 2 in the morning. The time when the human organism is in the deepest phase of sleep, when reaction time drops to a critical minimum, and the will to resist dissolves in fatigue. But for steel and oil, time of day does not exist. First comes the sound. A low, vibrating hum that makes plaster fall from the surviving workshop vaults. This isn't the sharp roar of the Soviet V2 diesel. This is the bassy, confident purr of gasoline Maybach engines. The Germans are coming. They aren't sneaking. They aren't hiding. Beams of no-tech blackout lights glide along Zavodskaya Street.
The blackout discipline is nominal. Narrow slits of light snatch piles of broken brick and twisted rails from the darkness. They are confident. Intelligence reported the sector clear, that the Russian defense here is just a handful of frightened infantrymen with Mosin rifles. Koval looks into the vision block of the commander's cupola. The glass is cloudy, scratched, but he sees silhouettes. The lead tank is a Panzer IV with a long-barreled gun, square turret, side skirts. Behind it, a second, a third. They crawl in a column, fender to fender, filling the narrow throat of the street. The distance is shrinking with frightening speed. 300 meters. 200. Inside the T-34, there is silence, broken only by the heavy breathing of 4 men and the quiet rustle of the radio converters. The air is stale, heavy. Uncle Vasya sits hunched over the levers. His legs are braced against the pedals so hard his thigh muscles turn to stone. He doesn't see the enemy. His eyes are the lieutenant's voice. His world has narrowed to the vision slit, showing only the gray wall of the workshop in front of the machine's nose. 150, whispers Koval. He feels no fear, only a coldness in his stomach and dryness in his mouth. Adrenaline hits his brain, sharpening his senses to the limit. He hears the German tracks clanking on the cobblestones. He hears the German commanders talking, leaning out of their hatches. They are too close. This is no longer an artillery duel. It's a knife fight in a phone booth. 100, the lieutenant's voice hardens. Loader Petter freezes, hugging the gun breech so as not to get hit during the lunge. The shell is already in the barrel. Armor-piercing, blunt-nosed with a ballistic cap. BR-350B. 6 kilograms of cast steel and explosives, ready to turn kinetic energy into heat and death. 50 meters. The Germans are right in front of the breach. They are exposing their sides, the ideal target. But they can't shoot from a standstill. The flash will give away their position, and a second later, a return volley will turn the workshop into a mass grave. They need to step out, strike, and vanish. Violate the laws of physics. Short! The command explodes the silence. Uncle Vasya drops the clutch. The tank jumps forward as if kicked from behind by a giant boot. The engine howls, gaining RPMs instantly, without hesitation. Tracks screech, biting into the concrete floor. Tons of metal tear away from their spot. 1 second, the tank's nose appears from the breach. Second, the turret enters the line of fire. Koval is no longer looking through the periscope. He is glued to the sight. The crosshairs settle exactly under the turret of the lead German, right where the ammo racks are hidden behind thin armor. Third second, the tank sharply dips its nose. Brakes squeal. This is the moment of truth. While the suspension dampens the oscillation, while the hull is still trembling, the lieutenant stomps on the firing pedal. Fire. In the enclosed space of the street, the sound of the 76mm gun firing is felt not with ears, but with the whole body. It is a punch of air pressure that knocks the wind out of you. The muzzle flash lights up the street brighter than the sun. The shell covers 50 meters faster than the German gunner can blink. Impact. A spray of sparks. The armor-piercing slug smashes through the side of the Panzer IV like cardboard. Inside the German tank, hell breaks loose. The detonation of the ammo load tears the turret, weighing several tons, off, and tosses it into the air like the lid of a boiling pot. A pillar of fire erupts from the hatches, illuminating the street with a deathly pale light. "Back!" screams Koval, swallowing gunpowder smoke. Uncle Vasya doesn't wait for the command. He has already slammed it into reverse. He feels the German turrets starting to turn toward them. 6 seconds. They have 6 seconds before the enemy's hydraulics and manual drives train their barrels on the flash. The T-34 roars, backing into the darkness of the workshop. The tracks slip on brick crumbs but catch. A jerk backward. The machine disappears into the breach just as suddenly as it appeared. The darkness closes in. Outside, chaos begins. The Germans panic. The lead tank is burning, blocking the road. The other machines try to back up, collide, break formation. Gunners feverishly spin hand wheels, searching for a target. "Feuer!" is shouted over the German radio. The roar of shots merges into a continuous drone. Tracers and slugs bite into the brick wall of the workshop where the Russian tank stood a second ago. Brick crumbles to dust. Concrete flies apart like shrapnel. Shells tear through empty space. No one is there. Inside the workshop, the T-34 stands behind a thick, load-bearing pillar, 10 meters from the firing point. The crew greedily gulps air. A blue fog stands in the fighting compartment. The fan can't keep up. Their eyes sting. "Load!" Koval rasps. Pieter, coughing, rams home a new shell. The clang of the breech sounds like music. Hands shake, but they do the work. Round 1 is won. The German is blinded, scared, and has lost his leader. But now they know where the beast lives. The element of surprise is exhausted. Now begins the mathematics of death by attrition. Koval looks at the trembling needles of the gauges. Oil temperature is creeping up. That was just one lunge. Ahead are hours of such work. "Change position," commands the lieutenant. "Point 2. Move before they zero in on the breach." The tank tears off, going deep into the ruins to pop out a minute later from a completely different hole. The pendulum has swung, and only a direct hit can stop it. The pause lasted no more than 10 seconds. Exactly that long was needed for the German commanders to snap out of their stupor and order the destruction of everything living in the sector. Zavodskaya Street exploded. Dozens of barrels, from 20mm anti-aircraft autocannons to the short-barreled guns of assault vehicles, hammered the facade of the workshop. The brickwork serving as cover boiled. Shrapnel, concrete dust, and red-hot metal turned the air into sandpaper. If infantry had stayed out there, they would have been swept away like dust by the wind. But the tank was no longer there. Deep inside the destroyed workshop, a deadly assembly line had started. The mechanism launched by Lieutenant Koval had reached design capacity. It was a rhythm that could not be broken for a fraction of a second. A glitch meant death. "Left!" A rasp in the headphones. Uncle Vasya rips the left steering lever toward himself. At this moment, he isn't a human. He is a hydraulic actuator. The tendons in his arms are taut as steel cables. The tank, roaring with its diesel, lunges toward the left breech. Tracks scrape on broken stone, striking showers of sparks. The hull lists, the suspension groans under the weight, but holds. Bursting into the light, the gray wall is replaced by the blackness of the night, streaked with tracers. Koval doesn't even look for weak spots. At a range of 100 meters, a 76mm slug punches through the frontal armor of a Panzer IV completely. Sniper precision isn't needed here. The reaction speed of a snake is. Silhouette in the sight. The German is turning his turret, but his barrel is looking to the right, to where the first shell came from. He is late. In this equation, he will always be second. "Fire!" The tank shudders through its whole frame. The gun recoil ejects the smoking casing onto the floor of the fighting compartment with a clang. It rings, hitting metal, and this ringing drowns in the engine's roar. "Back! Gas!" The T-34 jumps back into the shadow, and exactly 1 second later, a German shell slams into the spot where its turret just was, kicking up a fountain of brick dust. Miss. The pendulum swung left, Now it must swing right. Inside the turret reigns hellish confinement. Loader Petter works like an automaton with a broken safety switch. Shell. Weight, over 6 kilograms. He snatches it from the rack, turns in the narrow space, banging his elbows on the breech, and rams it into the barrel.
The sound of the closing wedge breech is the only metronome counting down the time of their lives.
Peter's hands are already bloody. Sharp edges of the ammo rack, burrs on the casings, impacts against metal. Skin splits, but he feels no pain. Blood mixes with oil on the shelves, making them slippery. Must not drop it. Drop it, you break the tempo. Break the tempo, you burn. "Right! High explosive!" yells Koval. Now the target is infantry, trying to filter toward the workshop walls under cover of armor. The driver works his feet and hands at the tempo of a mad pianist. Depressing the main clutch is an effort of 25 kilograms. Shifting gears is a jerk with the whole body. Tighten the steering clutch, release the brake, gas. Uncle Vasya is gasping. The temperature in the driver's compartment has passed 50 degrees Celsius. Sweat floods his eyes, acidic, salty, stinging so bad he can't see anything. But there's no time to wipe his face. His hands are busy with the levers.
He drives the tank by ear, by vibration, by barely perceptible changes in the engine's voice. He knows. If he hesitates on the shift, the gearbox will growl. Gears won't mesh, and the tank will stall. A standing tank is a dead tank. Exit right. The tank leaps out from behind a pile of collapsed beams. The Germans are expecting them on the left. They are hammering where the flash was a minute ago. But death comes from the flank. Fire! The high-explosive shell slams into a group of submachine gunners running along the wall. The explosion flash wipes away the shadows. A German half-track trying to slip through the noise takes shrapnel in the side and flares up like a gasoline torch. Back! And again a jerk into the darkness. The shockwave from a return German volley hits the frontal armor, but these are just glancing blows, ricochets. The tank is already gone. Inside the fighting compartment, gunpowder gases accumulate. The fan on the turret roof hums, but it's powerless to draw out this thick, acrid smog. Men cough. They feel nauseous. The hammer of hypoxia pounds in their temples. Carbon monoxide, the silent killer of tankers, is already here, seeping into the blood, slowing reactions. But adrenaline is still stronger than poison. Koval doesn't look at the crew. He has no right. He is the brain of this machine, soldered into the optical sight. "Armor piercing!" "Ready!" rasps Peter. "Point 3, forward!" It's a carousel, an assembly line of destruction. Exit, strike, retreat. Change position. Exit, strike, retreat. Casings on the floor roll underfoot, clinking, getting in the way, burning ankles. Peter kicks them aside, clearing space to work. The driver curses through his teeth, coaxing the gearbox not to fail, not to shatter from the savage shock loads. The steering clutches are smoking. The smell of burning Ferodo, the special lining material, becomes unbearable. It seems the iron will just melt right now, flowing onto the concrete in a glowing puddle. But the iron holds. Soviet steel, rough, heavy, forged in the rear by women and teenagers, withstands the extreme conditions. The transmission howls but pulls. The engine heats up. The water temperature needle has gone into the red zone, but it continues to put out 500 horsepower. The Germans are in a panic. They don't understand how many Russian tanks are in front of them. 1? 3? A battery? Shots ring out from different points, at different intervals. They see only muzzle flashes that sting them from the darkness and immediately vanish. They shoot into the void, pulverizing brick,
but cannot catch this ghost. "Again!" screams Koval. "Don't sleep! Tempo! Tempo!" His throat is so dry the words scratch his larynx like sandpaper. But he cannot stop. If the pendulum stops, the inertia of the battle will crush them. They are hostages of their own rhythm. Only movement, only aggression. There is no defense. Armor is an illusion. Only speed saves. The flash of a shot snatches Petter's face from the darkness, black with soot, with white trails of sweat, with crazy eyes. He grabs another shell. Blood from his fingers stays on the brass of the casing. Clang of the breech, roar of the engine, impact. The conveyor of death continues its work, and no one in this tank knows how many more revolutions this mechanism will make before it breaks. The Germans are good students. It took them 30 minutes and 5 burned machines to realize they aren't fighting a tank company, but a ghost. Hunting a ghost with sights is useless. It just needs to be buried. The enemy tactic changed instantly. Instead of aiming at muzzle flashes, German assault guns and supporting tanks that had moved up began to methodically demolish the workshop itself. They shifted fire from the lower level to the load-bearing structures and vaults. Heavy, high-explosive shells came into play. The air inside the ruins became solid as cotton wool. From above, from a height of 20 meters, concrete beams and chunks of rebar began to rain down. The roar was such that it ceased to be perceived by ears. It just beat against the chest cavity, knocking the heart out of rhythm. The escape routes Koval had so carefully cleared and memorized were vanishing. Where a minute ago there was a clear path for the pendulum, now lay a pile of broken brick a meter high. "Back! Hard left!" Koval's scream drowned in the crack of an explosion. A shell hit the wall right above the breach from which the nose of the T-34 had just poked out. The brickwork exploded in shrapnel. In the driver's compartment happened what every driver feared. A shard of brick, ricocheting off the armored visor, flew into the slightly open hatch. They kept it open a palm's width for ventilation. Otherwise, they would suffocate.
The impact hit Uncle Vasya in the forehead, right above the eyebrow.
Skin split, and thick, dark blood instantly flooded his eyes. The tank jerked and froze. The engine roared at idle, losing precious seconds. "Vasya!" yelled the lieutenant, kicking the back of the driver's seat. The driver didn't answer. He didn't let go of the levers. With one hand he ripped an oily rag from his neck, smearing blood and dirt over his face, trying to see at least something. But a red veil obscured his eyes. The pain was dull, deafening, but somewhere in the subcortex, in that part of the brain responsible for survival, the program continued to run. He was blind, but he remembered. His hands found the shift gate on their own. His legs, living a life separate from his consciousness, depressed the clutch. The tank, roaring like a wounded beast, tore backward, blindly climbing over piles of debris. Uncle Vasya drove the machine by touch, guided by the hull's tilt and vibration.
He had become part of the transmission.
Blood dripped onto the levers, making them slippery, but his fingers gripped the metal with a death grip. Inside the fighting compartment, thermal hell began. The V2 engine's cooling system was working at its limit. Radiators, clogged with dust, couldn't cope. Water temperature jumped to 110 degrees. The oil was boiling. Heat radiated from the glowing engine bulkhead like from an open blast furnace. The air temperature inside the tank passed 60 degrees. The men were boiling alive. Sweat didn't evaporate. Humidity was 100%. Their tunics could be wrung out. They clung to their bodies like a second skin. Touching any unpainted metal left a burn. The gun breech was so hot one could light a cigarette from it, if anyone had the strength to reach for a cigarette. But scarier than the heat was the gas.
The fan on the turret roof had long ceased to cope with the gunpowder fumes from frequent firing.
Carbon monoxide concentration reached a critical mark. It was a quiet, cottony dying. Loader Petter suddenly slowed down. His movements became fluid, as if underwater. He took another shell, swayed, and slowly slid down the ammo rack wall, clutching the 6-kilogram slug to his chest like a baby. His eyes rolled back. "Petter, up!" Koval spun around and kicked the loader in the shoulder with his boot, cruelly, hard. There was no pain, receptors were dulled, but the blow brought the guy out of the faint. Petter shook his head, gulping the poisoned air. His gaze focused on the breach. Reflex worked faster than thought. He stood up, swaying, and rammed the shell into the barrel. Clang of the breach. This sound was the only thing keeping them conscious. Jerk, strike, retreat. The tank turned into a gas chamber. The radio operator gunner below, curled up by the machine gun, vomited bile right at his feet, but continued changing drums. His body was failing. Lungs were burning. His heart pounded at a frequency of 180 beats per minute, trying to pump blood thick from dehydration. And the machinery screamed. The steering clutches were burning in the literal sense. The linings smoked, filling the tank with an acrid, sweet stench that made eyes water. The main clutch was slipping. With every sharp start, the engine howled, gaining RPMs, but the tank reacted with a delay, as if stuck in a swamp. The oil in the transmission lost viscosity and turned into water. Gears worked dry, with a metallic screech foreshadowing a seize-up. "Come on, old girl, come on," whispered Uncle Vasya, with smashed lips, coaxing 40 tons of iron not to die. He didn't see where he was going. He just yanked the levers, executing the lieutenant's commands that sounded in his headset like the voice of God. "Right! Gas!" The T-34 slammed its side against a pillar. Sparks, grind. Tracks scraped concrete, tearing out chunks of the floor. The machine tilted, nearly flipping, but stayed upright. They were no longer human. They were a biomechanical appendage of the gun. No thoughts remained. No fear remained. Only rhythm. Load. Aim. Fire. Roll back. Lose consciousness for a second during the recoil. Wake up from hitting the wall. Repeat. Koval looked at the ammo indicator. 12 armor-piercing left, and 5 high explosive. That was enough for another 10 minutes of combat. Or for eternity. Outside, the world was collapsing. The factory was turning into rubble. But inside the glowing steel box, in delirium, smoke, and stench, 4 men continued their deadly dance, violating all laws of physiology and mechanics. The machine was dying with them. But as long as the crankshaft turned, they were immortal. Dawn over Stalingrad did not come. It seeped through a dense curtain of smoke and dust like dirty water through a bandage. The light was gray, deathly, devoid of color. At 6 in the morning, the artillery cannonade suddenly fell silent. First, the German mortars went quiet. Then the Soviet 45s on the flanks stopped snarling. The silence hit their ears harder than the roar. It wasn't the silence of peace, but the vacuum after a blast wave. In Lieutenant Koval's ears stood a continuous, high-pitched ring. Capillaries in his eardrums burst from pressure changes were making themselves known. He barely peeled his eyelids open. His lashes were stuck together with soot. Koval pushed the heavy commander's cupola hatch, jammed by a shrapnel impact. The metal yielded with a long screech sounding like a moan. The lieutenant leaned out to his shoulders. The cold morning air burned his lungs, clogged with carbon monoxide, triggering a coughing fit. He wiped his tearing eyes with a dirty glove
and looked at Zavodskaya Street. What opened to his gaze resembled not a battlefield, but a scrapyard arranged by a mad giant.
On a stretch 200 meters long, squeezed between the ruins of workshops, 11 machines were smoking. The arithmetic of the night shift was written in black smoke on the gray sky. 8 German Panzer IV tanks and 3 Hanomag half-tracks remained forever in this concrete sack. They stood in unnatural poses. The lead tank, the one that took the first slug, had turned into a pile of burnt iron. Its turret lay 10 meters from the hull, half buried in a crater. The gun barrel was buried in the earth, as if trying to find salvation there. The road wheels had melted, the rubber had burned off, leaving bare metal rims. Following it, nose buried in a wall, the second tank had frozen. A neat, almost surgical hole 76 millimeters in diameter gaped in its side. Around the puncture, the metal had turned white from the heat of impact. From the open hatches, a thin stream of smoke still drifted. Everything inside had burned out: ammo, wiring, crew. A third tank was spun across the street. Its track was broken. The T-34 had hamstrung its running gear with high explosive, then finished the immobilized vehicle with a shot to the side. The track ribbon had slid onto the cobblestones like a snake, exposing the drive sprocket. The half-tracks suffered the worst. Their thin armor couldn't withstand close explosive blasts. Their hulls were peeled open like tin cans, sides turned outward by the blast wave. Inside, a mash of burnt equipment and human bodies. A bit further, in the haze, silhouettes of several more machines could be made out. The Germans hadn't dared to go further. Heavy tanks coming in the second wave had backed off. German command, judging by intercepts, was convinced they had run into a layered defense. They reported to headquarters about a battery of anti-tank guns and camouflaged bunkers in the factory ruins. It never occurred to them that this entire column had been ground up by a single tank, dashing around the workshop like a madman. Fear of the unknown stopped the armada where an infantry division would have failed. Koval shifted his gaze to his machine. The T-34 stood behind a semi-destroyed brick wall, almost blending with it in color. The tank was unrecognizable. The green protective paint 4BO was gone. It had burned off, peeled away, covered by a layer of black, oily soot and brick dust. Now it was the black Sormovo. The engine deck was piled with chunks of plaster and broken glass, mudguards torn off. The left track shone with a fresh chip. A ricochet had passed tangentially, miraculously not shattering the track pin. The gun barrel was black, sooted to the very base. The paint on it had bubbled from overheating. The machine breathed heat. Even now, an hour after the battle, waves of heat radiated from the armor, distorting the air.
The metal cooled, making sounds like a ticking clock. Click, click. This was overheated steel contracting, returning to its normal state. Around the tank, the ground was plowed up. Track marks overlaid each other hundreds of times, forming a complex, chaotic pattern. It was the cardiogram of the battle. Sharp turns, deep gouges from wheel spin at the start, long furrows from skidding during braking. If looked at from above, it seemed some mechanical monster had whirled here in an insane waltz. On the armor, right by the driver's hatch, a dark crust had baked. It was Uncle Vasya's blood, forced out of the wound with every jerk. It mixed with dust and oil, becoming part of the camouflage. No triumph, no joy of victory, only a leaden heaviness in the back of the head and a taste of bitterness in the mouth. Koval looked at his handiwork without emotion. It was a job done. Dirty, heavy work of disposing of enemy equipment. 8 boxes,
3 half-tracks, 100 enemy soldiers,
and 4 living dead men in an iron box amidst the ruins. The wind drove a scrap of some German newspaper along the street, catching on the track of a disabled panzer. The Stalingrad morning was claiming its rights, illuminating the graveyard of Wehrmacht ambitions and a lone, black, smoking Soviet tank that refused to die on schedule. The engine sneezed one last time and went quiet. The huge 12-cylinder diesel, which had run at extreme power for 4 hours straight, finally stopped. Along with it vanished the vibration that all this time had been the only confirmation that this world still existed. Silence fell. It was scarier than the roar. In battle, silence means death. Here, it meant life, but the brain refused to realize it. Lieutenant Koval was the first to try unbuckling his throat microphone. His fingers wouldn't obey. They were curled, as if cramped, resembling wooden hooks. Fine motor skills had failed completely. The nervous system, exhausted by a wild cocktail of adrenaline and cortisol, had shut down the periphery. Koval yanked the strap, tearing the leather, and the headset fell onto the gun breech with a dull thud. He reached for the hatch. His shoulders felt filled with lead. Every movement required willpower comparable to lifting a barbell. He squeezed himself out of the turret, centimeter by centimeter. Fresh air, cold, damp, with a taste of Volga water, hit his nostrils not as salvation, but like smelling salts. His head spun from the oxygen overdose. Koval rolled over the side and slid heavily down the armor onto the concrete slabs. His legs buckled. He didn't fall, but rather settled, leaning his back against the drive sprocket. The armor was hot, almost burning, but this heat was now the only thing connecting him to reality. He reached into his tunic pocket for a pouch, took out a paper, poured some tobacco, and then it hit him. His hands started shaking. It wasn't the tremor of fear. It was the tremor of a man who had passed high-voltage current through himself. A coarse, high-amplitude shake. Tobacco spilled onto his knees. The paper tore. Koval stared dully at his hands, as if they belonged to a stranger. He tried again. Useless. His fingers danced their own dance, continuing to press invisible firing buttons and turn aiming wheels. "Got a match?" The voice sounded like a dry branch snapping. His own voice seemed foreign to him. No one answered. No one climbed out of the driver's hatch. Uncle Vasya remained inside. Down there, in the driver's compartment, it was tightest and hottest. He sat, leaning back against the hard seat back, looking at the levers. His face was a mask of baked blood and grease. The wound on his forehead had stopped bleeding, sealing with a black crust, but his eyes were inflamed from sweat and strain. He didn't leave. He stroked the levers. His broad, calloused palms, beaten bloody against metal, slowly slid along the handles of the steering clutches, polished to a shine. He touched them gently, like one touches a sick child. He felt the metal slowly cooling under his fingers. "Forgive me, Mother," he whispered with just his lips. "Forgive me, darling. I drove you hard, pulled your veins out." The driver was apologizing to the machine for the violence, for the gear shocks she took, for the overheated oil, for the burned clutches. For him, the T-34 in these hours was not a set of mechanisms, but a living being that was dying to save their lives. He stroked the dashboard, wiping dust off the tachometer glass with a finger. He knew the transmission was done, that the engine would likely knock on the next start. The tank had given everything it had. A resource calculated for 200 hours had burned out in one night. From the turret, like a sack of sand, rolled Loader Peter. He fell on all fours and immediately vomited. His stomach was empty. Only bile and mucus came out.
The body was ridding itself of carbon monoxide toxins. Peter coughed, spitting black saliva. His lungs were clogged with gunpowder soot. He lay on the cold concrete, cheek pressed to the ground, greedily gulping air, but couldn't get enough. The radio operator, the youngest of them, sat on the track, staring at a single point. There was nothing in his eyes. Emptiness. Pupils dilated, gaze unfocused. He saw not the factory yard littered with enemy corpses, but an endless ribbon of machine gun tracers disappearing into darkness. His eyelid was twitching. No triumph. No shouts of "Hurrah!" No hugs. The newsreels lie. Real victory in such a battle looks like a catastrophe. Men returned from the other side don't rejoice. They are hollowed out. Inside is a scorched desert. Emotions burned along with the diesel. Only leaden, earth-pressing fatigue, and the smell remained.
The smell was monstrous.
It smelled not only of burnt gunpowder and overheated iron, it smelled of roasted meat, a sickly sweet, nauseating smell from the destroyed German tanks. It smelled of human excrement. In battle, the body often doesn't control sphincters, and this isn't shame, it's physiology. It smelled of vomit and old blood. This smell saturated clothes, hair, skin. It seemed it had eaten into the soul itself, and washing it off would be impossible. Koval finally gave up trying to roll a cigarette. He just crumpled the paper and threw it on the concrete. He raised his eyes to his machine, a black, sooted carcass from which heat still radiated. It stood amidst the ruins as a monument to itself. Around it, 8 destroyed panzers. 8 crews that just yesterday wrote letters home. 8 laughed. Now it was just coal. The lieutenant looked at his watch. The glass was broken, but the mechanism ticked. 6:30 in the morning. The battle lasted 4.5 hours. 4.5 hours of continuous balancing on a razor blade. Statistically, a tank's life in urban combat is 3 attacks or 9 minutes. They had lived an eternity. Uncle Vasya finally climbed out of the hatch. He came down heavily, shuffling his feet like an old man. Walked up to the commander, silently took a crumpled pack of trophy cigarettes from his pocket, pulled one out, lit it with his lighter. His hands shook less, the tractor driver's habit to vibration showing, and handed it to Koval. The lieutenant took a drag. The smoke burned his throat, but this burn was pleasant. It cleared his mind a little. "Alive," Uncle Vasya said hoarsely. It wasn't a question or a statement. It was a statement of fact that was hard to believe. "For now, yes," Koval answered, blowing a stream of smoke into the gray sky. They sat together, shoulder to shoulder, dirty, stinking, deafened. 4 men who had just stopped a tank company. But they didn't feel like heroes. They felt like workers who had finished a shift at a blast furnace where human fates were smelted instead of steel. And this shift ended only because the material for smelting ran out. Silence fell on them again. But now, footsteps could be heard in this silence. From the direction of Soviet positions, people were running toward them. Infantry that didn't believe their eyes. But the crew didn't care. They wanted only one thing, to close their eyes and for this ringing in their ears to stop. But the ringing didn't leave. It stayed with them forever, like this dawn, like this smell of burning. Regimental headquarters was located in the basement of a surviving administrative building, 2 kilometers from the front line. Here was a different world, a world where war turned into geometry on paper. The air here didn't smell of burning and blood. It smelled of cheap cologne, printer's ink, dry heat from a potbelly stove, and freshly brewed tea. For Lieutenant Koval, who an hour ago was breathing carbon monoxide and death, this smell was unbearably sharp. Alien. He stood before the Chief of Staff's desk, dirty, black with soot, in coveralls burned through in several places. A puddle of oily mud had flowed from his boots onto the clean wooden floor. He looked like an alien from the underworld who had accidentally stumbled into an accounting office. Staff officers in ironed tunics with clean collars looked at him with distrust. In their eyes, disgust mixed with fear could be read. Koval spoke loudly. He still heard poorly after 4 hours of cannonade in an enclosed space. "Reporting!" The lieutenant's voice broke into a rasp. "Enemy attack in the sorting workshop sector repelled. Destroyed. 8 Panzer IV type tanks, 3 half-tracks, up to a company of infantry. No casualties in the crew. The machine has running gear damage. Transmission is at the limit. Requires major overhaul." Silence hung in the office. Only the scribe's pen scratched. The major, sitting at the map, raised his head. His face was clean-shaven, pink, well-fed. He adjusted his glasses and looked at Koval like a madman. 8 tanks? The major asked again, emphasizing the word 8. With 1 crew? In urban terrain? Lieutenant, do you understand that a false report in combat conditions is grounds for a tribunal? Koval clenched his fists. The dirt under his nails was ingrained forever. He wanted to walk over and smash this major's face into the table, smash it so he could taste brick dust. But he stood at attention. "I reported the fact, Comrade Major. You can verify." "We'll verify," the colonel, the regimental commander sitting in the corner, threw out dryly. He stood up, put on his cap, and nodded to Koval. "Let's go. Show me your shooting gallery." The road to the Red October factory took 15 minutes in a Willys bouncing over craters. The colonel was silent the whole way. He looked at the smoking ruins of the city and frowned. He was an old soldier who had been through the Civil War and knew there are no miracles in war. There is either lying or mistakes or mass heroism, which usually ends in a mass grave. The survival of 1 tank against a company didn't fit into any regulation. When the car stopped at the workshop entrance, the colonel got out and lit a cigarette. Guards had already cordoned off the perimeter. Sappers were checking the destroyed German equipment for booby traps. The picture was epic. A steel graveyard of the Wehrmacht. The carcasses of German machines were still smoking, filling the yard with blue smoke. But the colonel wasn't looking at the corpses of enemy tanks. He was looking under his feet. The entire area in front of the workshop, all entrances and exits from the ruins, were slashed by tracks. The ground was turned into mush, but in this chaos, a frightening system could be traced. Track marks overlaid each other, forming a complex geometric pattern. This wasn't just driving. This was a cardiogram of madness. Sharp, acute angle turns in place, where the tank tore its steering clutches, turning on one track. Deep gouges from track links at start points, where the diesel howled at the limit, tearing 40 tons from a standstill in a split second. Long, sliding skid marks from braking. The colonel squatted and ran a finger along a track mark on the concrete. The stone was scraped, crumbled to dust. "Look at this," he said quietly to the approaching major, who now looked pale and lost. "Look at this script. This isn't driving. This is a pendulum." He stood up and walked to Koval's T-34. The tank stood in the shadow, cooling. The colonel put his hand on the final drive housing. It was hot. He knew that inside, under the armor, the mechanisms now presented a pitiful sight. "Mechanic to me," commanded the colonel. Uncle Vasya climbed out of the hatch, wiping his hands with a rag. He didn't snap to attention. He had no strength. He just stood and looked at the brass with the tired eyes of a man who knows the price of every bolt in this machine. "How did you not tear the gearbox apart, Father?" asked the colonel, looking at the tracks on the ground. "There are shifts every 3 seconds here. Jerk, stop, back. Our clutches burn on a march, but here, how?" "Double clutching, Comrade Colonel," the driver wheezed. "And with rev matching. Tightened the main clutch to the limit before the battle so it wouldn't slip. It's hard, of course. Leg cramps up. But the machine jumps. If we started smoothly, we would have burned." The colonel shook his head. He walked around the tank, examined the holes in the German machines. All clean. Armor-piercing hits to the sides, under the turrets. A master's work. "This is not according to regulations," he finally said, turning to Koval. His voice was firm, but the command stiffness had vanished. "Field regulations for armored troops prescribe firing from short halts or on the move, but as part of a unit. What you pulled off is partisan warfare. You destroyed the engine life. You burned the brake bands. By all rules, I should send you to the brig for barbaric treatment of entrusted equipment." The major behind him nodded in agreement, ready to write down the order. "But," the colonel paused, looking at the 8 burnt German boxes, "winners aren't judged." He took out a cigarette case, removed a Kazbek cigarette, and offered it to Koval. It was a gesture of supreme recognition. A staff officer giving a light to a dirty trench lieutenant. "Write this down, Major," he threw over his shoulder. "Recommend the crew for decorations. Tank, to repair, priority queue. And get the division's chief of combat training to me. Let him look at these tracks, before the rain washes them away." Koval took the cigarette. His hands were still shaking, but less now. He watched the staff officers walking through the ruins, pacing off distances, drawing something in their notebooks. They were trying to digitize the feat, to turn the bloody meat grinder of a night battle into dry lines of a report. They drew diagrams, arrows, sectors, but Koval knew they would never understand the main thing. On paper, this battle looked like a tactical masterpiece. In reality, it was a dirty, sweaty, terrifying brawl in a dark basement, where the survivor wasn't the smarter one, but the one who hit faster with brass knuckles. "Comrade Colonel," he called out to the commander, who was already walking to the car. "Don't take the tank for long. We're used to it. There won't be another like it. This one has character." The colonel turned, grinned into his mustache, and nodded. "You'll have your tank, Lieutenant. We'll patch it up and return it. Rest." "You did the work of a whole battery today." The Willies drove off, kicking up dust. Koval remained standing by his machine. He looked at the track-scarred earth. The staff had gone to write reports. The paper front accepted the victory, digested it, and filed it in folder case number. But here, on the ground, remained only twisted steel and the smell of death, which you can't write into any award list. The truth was here, in these deep furrows on the concrete, not in the red arrows on the major's map. 2 weeks later, Lieutenant Koval was recalled from the front line. The order was strange, not fitting the logic of the meat grinder. Transfer experience. In the rear, on a training ground soaked by November rains, where mud was knee-deep and sucked at boots with a squelching sound, replacements were gathered. 20 young lieutenants, fresh from academies, and 50 drivers, many of whom had seen a tank only in textbook pictures. Koval had to teach them to survive, teach them to dance the very pendulum that saved his life in the ruins of Red October. But the pedagogy didn't go well from the first hour. "Clutch!" yelled Koval, drowning out the engine roar. "Don't drop it! Ride it! You're not on a tractor, you're in a coffin!" The training T-34 jerked in convulsions and stalled. The driver, a cow-licked kid of about 19, guiltily leaned out of the hatch. His face was red from strain and shame. He was afraid of the machine. For him, 40 tons of iron were an uncontrollable monster, living its own malicious life. Koval jumped off the armor into the mud, feeling cold rage boiling inside. He walked up to the side and punched the fender. "You're a corpse," he said calmly to the kid. "While you were looking for second gear, you were already burned. A German gunner won't wait while you remember where your shift gate is." He tried to explain the rhythm to them, drew diagrams on wet armor with chalk.
Explained the physics of the lunge, how to use recoil inertia to shift into first gear, how to catch the moment when the tank hangs before changing direction. He spoke of seconds as precious stones. 3 seconds per shot, he hammered into the lieutenants standing in a circle under the freezing rain. "Jump out, strike, leave. If you linger for a 4th second, write your will." They nodded. They tried. But when they sat behind the levers, the magic vanished. Rough, violent struggle with mechanisms began. Tanks roared, belching black smoke. Rookies burned main clutches trying to start with a jerk, as Koval demanded. They didn't feel the machine. They didn't have that neural connection with the transmission that is developed only by fear of death. Instead of a smooth, deadly lunge, came a clumsy twitching. The tank moved out of cover too slowly, exposing its side to an imaginary shot. Gunners couldn't acquire targets in the rocking hull. Loaders fell, knocked off their feet by sharp braking. It was a disaster. What Koval's crew did on reflexes looked with these guys like an attempt to play a complex symphony without knowing the notes. By the evening of the 3rd day, the regiment engineer, an elderly second-rank military engineer, came to the range. He watched for a long time as another cadet raped the gearbox, trying to engage reverse without fully stopping the shafts. The grinding of gears was such that it set teeth on edge. "Stop it," the engineer said quietly, but with authority. Koval turned around. He was black with soot, angry, and more tired than after a night battle. "Lieutenant," the engineer walked up close, looking at the smoking engine compartment of the training vehicle. "What are you doing?" "Teaching them to fight," Koval snapped. "Teaching them not to be targets." "You are teaching them to break the equipment," the engineer cut off harshly. "In 3 days, you've destroyed the clutch on 2 machines. The final drive went on the 3rd. Gear teeth sheared off like with a knife. Do you understand that these tanks won't even reach the front? Better they burn on the range than with men in the first battle," Koval parried. The engineer took off his glasses and wiped them with a handkerchief. In his eyes read the tired wisdom of a man who knows that war is primarily logistics and resources. "Listen, Lieutenant. I read your report. What you did at the factory is a miracle. It's high art, multiplied by insane luck and the skill of a specific crew. Your mechanic is a genius or a madman. But this," he swept his hand over the muddy field where 3 tanks had stalled. "This is a mass army. We cannot train virtuosos. We don't have time for it. A tank lives 3 attacks in battle. If we teach them your pendulum, they'll ruin the transmission on the march." Koval was silent. He understood the logistics officer was right. His tactic was a loner's tactic, a tactic of desperation. It required absolute fusion of the crew, earned by months of shared life and death. You can't take yesterday's schoolboy, put him behind levers, and force him to dance a waltz on a 40-ton behemoth. He'll simply burn the clutches and stop in the middle of the battlefield as a perfect target. "It's art, Lieutenant," the engineer added, softer.
And we need a trade. Rough, simple trade. Go forward, shoot from a short stop, crush with tracks. Your method is too expensive, both for equipment and for people. I forbid it. The next day, training was cancelled. Koval was summoned to HQ and handed orders to return to his unit. His experiment failed. The system rejected the pendulum like a foreign body. War demanded simple solutions: an avalanche of steel, a wall of fire, quantity transitioning into quality.
Individual mastery bordering on suicide did not lend itself to mass production. Koval walked to the truck that was to take him back to the hell of Stalingrad. He smoked, greedily inhaling acrid smoke. He felt bitter. He wanted to give these kids a chance, wanted to give them the tool that saved him. But it turned out this tool was too heavy for their hands. In the back of the truck, he watched the receding training ground. There, in the mud, instructors were already teaching rookies according to the old manual. Move, stop, shoot. Simple, reliable, deadly. He was returning to his crew, to Uncle Vasya, who felt the tank with his skin, to Piotr, who threw shells faster than an automatic loader, to the silent radio man. They were the only carriers of this knowledge, a secret sect of suicide soldiers possessing a forbidden technique. The experience was not passed on. It remained inside them, locked in a cramped skull box saturated with the smell of burnt oil.
Koval understood. Most likely, this experience would die with them. Someday, in another battle, a German slug would be faster than their reaction, or the worn transmission would fail, or luck would simply run out. And then the secret of the tank pendulum would turn into a line in the archive, killed in action. But while they were alive, they would dance. Not for tactical textbooks, not for medals, but simply to live one more minute. The lieutenant threw the cigarette butt into the road mud. Ahead, on the horizon, the glow of the burning city was already visible. He was going home, to his iron-clattering home, where words aren't needed, only rhythm, clutch, gas, fire. The endless war continued, and there was no place in it for students, only masters and corpses. July 1943, the Kursk salient, area of Ponyrdy Station. There were no saving ruins here.
There were no corners behind which to hide a 30-ton machine, and no basements blocking sectors of fire. There was only steppe, scorched by the sun, smelling of wormwood and overheated metal. The horizon trembled from the heat haze. The pendulum tactic was born in a stone labyrinth, and there it was queen. But in the open field, the geometry of war worked by other rules. Here, ballistics and optics ruled. Battle distances increased from 50 meters to 2 kilometers. Lieutenant Koval led his platoon into the attack, covering infantry lying in the dry grass. It was a new machine. The Stalingrad one had been written off as scrap after the third overhaul. The metal got tired. The hull cracked from endless shock loads. The new tank was fresh, factory-made, with paint not yet worn off, but the crew remained the same. Uncle Vasya on the levers, Piotr at the breech, the silent radio man below. They died instantly.
They weren't killed by an equal opponent in a duel where nerves decide everything. They were killed by the mathematics of calibers. A German Tiger from a distance of 1.5 kilometers, standing in a hull-down position, simply leveraged the advantage of its 88mm gun. The Wehrmacht gunner saw the T-34 in his Zeiss optics as if on the palm of his hand. Koval, in his cloudy sight, saw only a gray strip on the horizon. There was no dance. Uncle Vasya didn't even have time to pull the lever to start the maneuver. An armor-piercing shell hit the frontal plate, punched through it like paper, and caused the ammo rack to detonate. The turret was torn off and thrown 10 meters. The explosion was such that not even dog tags remained of the crew. Fire devoured everything: flesh, documents, letters from home. 3 minutes later, only a black, smoking skeleton remained of the formidable combat unit. One of hundreds just like it scattered across the Russian steppe. They vanished as quickly as gunpowder burns in a casing. In staff reports, their death was noted with one line: Lieutenant Koval's crew did not return from battle while executing mission to support Rifle Battalion. No details. War is statistics. In the scale of a battle where thousands of tanks participated on both sides, the loss of one crew, even a unique one, was a statistical error. The secret of the deadly pendulum left with them. After the war, military historians and methodologists of the Armored Forces Academy analyzed the experience of street fighting in Stalingrad. They sifted through tons of reports, looking for patterns. Koval's tactic fell into their hands in the form of that very report from the colonel who saw the track marks at the Red October factory. But it didn't enter the regulations. Too complex, too dangerous, too dependent on the individual skill of the driver, which is impossible to cultivate under conditions of mass conscription. In a tactics textbook for 1946, only a short paragraph appeared, a dry footnote in small print. In conditions of dense urban development, rhythmic maneuvering is permitted to exit enemy fire. See Appendix 4. The author's name was not mentioned. The surname Koval dissolved in archival dust, like thousands of other surnames. Decades passed. Volgograd, Mamayev Kurgan, the huge concrete motherland calls, piercing the low autumn sky with a sword. The wind from the Volga blows here always, piercing through, blowing tears even from those who have forgotten how to cry. At the foot of the monument, leaning on a cane, stands an old man. His jacket is heavy with ribbon bars, but he stands straight. Next to him is a boy of about 10, looking at the eternal flame with wide open eyes. The old man is not a tanker. He was a repairman in that very regiment. He is the one who changed burnt clutches on Koval's tank, who cursed, beating his hands bloody on red-hot iron, and who saw those tracks on the concrete, resembling a madman's cardiogram. "Grandpa, was it scary?" the boy asks, looking at the lists of names on the granite. The old man is silent for a long time. He isn't looking at the stone. He is looking through time, there, into October 42, into the darkness of the destroyed workshop. "Scary, grandson, is when there's silence." The old man's voice creaks like an ungreased hinge. "But when you're working, it's not scary." He points with his cane somewhere toward the Red October factory district, now barely visible behind new residential blocks. "Down there was one tank," he says quietly. "We called it the Black Sormovo. It was black not from paint, but from soot. It burned 3 times but didn't surrender. Inside it sat men made of iron." The boy listens, holding his breath. "They didn't just fight," continues the old man. "They danced. Imagine a waltz, only instead of music, the roar of explosions, and instead of parquet, broken brick. Forward, back, forward, back. The Germans went crazy. They thought there was a whole army. But there was one lieutenant, one tractor driver, and 2 other guys." "And what happened to them?" the grandson asks. "They left," the veteran answers simply. "Left into the sky, like smoke. At Kursk. But that dance, I still hear their tracks grinding. The earth remembers." The wind picks up his words and carries them to the river. Names may be erased. Paper in archives yellows and crumbles to dust. Iron rusts and becomes part of the soil. But the energy of a feat does not disappear without a trace. It remains in the geometry of restored streets, in the silence of peaceful courtyards grown on the site of ruins. That lone T-34, spinning its deadly pendulum in a stone sack, won not just a battle, it won time. Those very hours and minutes the Wehrmacht lacked to push the defenders into the Volga. Lieutenant Koval's crew became the grain of sand that jammed the huge mechanism of death. The old man puts his hand on the cold granite of the memory wall. Under his palm, the rough stone warms up. "They didn't die," he says firmly. "As long as even one person remembers how one machine stopped 100, they are alive. The mechanism works as long as there is a spark, and they were that spark." Below, on the Volga, a white ship moves. Life goes on. But deep underground, under layers of asphalt and concrete, the Stalingrad clay still holds shards of that night. Torn metal, lead bullets, and the memory of a frantic rhythm. Clutch, gas, fire. A rhythm that became the heartbeat of victory.